Who likes to drive? Who doesn't like to drive? 5 people don't like to drive. I love to drive. Anyone want to guess why? I'm going to be calling on people. Okay, I'll answer this one. There are 3 reasons that I like to drive. The first one is I like being on my own time. I hate rushing to make a flight. I hate getting to the airport and missing that flight. And my husband will tell you that happens often. And I like being able to leave when I want to leave, and I like to be able to drive around when I get to where I'm going. The second reason I like to drive is I like to bring my dogs with me when I can travel. And I have big dogs, and you would notice if I tried to sneak them on an airplane. And then the third reason is the main reason. So this is, if you look back here, this is where I drove to, I think about 4 or 5 weeks ago, drove down to the Houston area after the hurricane, drove around a lot of small towns. This is where I drove 2 weeks ago and 3 weeks ago from Indianapolis to Kansas City, and I stopped in a number of towns on the way. And then this is where I drove to actually last weekend, from Indianapolis down to, actually this map doesn't show you all the places, but down to Atlanta, then to a little town called Lumpkin, Georgia. Anybody know Lumpkin? Lumpkin, Georgia. And then up through South Carolina, West Virginia, Ohio. I stopped in Dayton, and then I went home to Indianapolis. Here's what's really interesting, right? When you drive around this country, and it's a massive country, right? You hear the same thing that you hear when you drive around Sweden or India or the Philippines or Iraq. And you hear the same thing also from communities that are thriving and from communities that are actually underserved and are not thriving. And you hear one word again and again and again: jobs, right? So in communities that are thriving, you hear people say it's really great. We have a lot of jobs. People are creating businesses. They're hiring. We have a lot of people coming in. And in places that are underserved and that have high rates of unemployment and that are of great concern for all of us, Indiana, everywhere, people are saying we don't have enough jobs. And we're not getting jobs, and what do? Everybody's leaving, jobs have gone, people have gone, and we're sort of stuck. So it seems like a really interesting fix, right? But it's not. So where do jobs come from? So I am going to call on someone. Anybody? Yes, sir. You answered the question 6 steps ahead, but okay. So entrepreneurs. So explain to me how that happens. Okay, all right. So jobs come from people that create jobs, entrepreneurs, right? And then the entrepreneurs themselves are actually self-employing, right? Those people will often start businesses, they expand, and through the expansion, other people get hired. So you have job makers or job creators, and then you also have job takers, right? And so what's interesting is jobs feed into and sort of lay the foundation for what we would call a virtuous circle, right? And in this circle, we have an entrepreneur, right? An entrepreneur starts a business. That business services consumers, so it brings some kind of value, which is benefit number 1. Through bringing value and through expanding, the entrepreneur may then hire people, so that's job creation, which brings about income creation or income generation. That's benefit number 2. And then the third benefit is sort of indirect relationship to our public welfare. And that is that by serving the market and by hiring and by expanding, entrepreneurs widen, broaden, and also basically diversify the tax base, right? And so the reason this becomes a virtuous circle is because the tax base is what pays for things like roads, what pays for things like good public schools, and it all comes full circle when the entrepreneur needs to hire, right? Because good schools mean good potential employees. You can cut a lot of time if you have good roads. right? So your productivity can go up. And so that's the virtuous circle that we're very interested in. And so it seems like a fairly simple equation. It's not, right? It's difficult enough in prosperous societies. It's much more complicated in places of crisis, right? So how do we get this kind of virtuous circle moving, right? If you have a place of crisis, you're really stuck in a vicious circle, which is you have low employment, low business creation, poor public services because you don't have a lot of tax revenue, and that circle sort of perpetuates. So it's the opposite of a virtuous circle. How do you basically kick your foot, stop the circle, and then get it to spin the other way, right? Any answers? We don't have any. So think about it this way. If I start a business and, let me see, I'm going to make shoes. I like shoes. So let's say I start making shoes and I build a factory, right? Or I build a manufacturing facility. And I'm in a place where there's a terrorist attack, right? It's going to profoundly affect what I do and how I invest after the attack, right? If I lose my inventory, I have a few options. I could just close the business, right? I could continue as if nothing happened and restock and work with my suppliers. It's very unlikely I'm going to do that. And the third option is that I could continue the business, but I could keep less inventory. So I would basically lower my risk exposure in the event that there were another attack. And you don't want that to happen because then my ability to meet consumer demand also goes down. And so that is the kind of vicious circle that we see in places that are often hit by terrorist attacks, that are in prolonged conflict, but we also see it in places that have natural disasters, right, and that don't fully recover. So when we think about what we can do, right, there's no easy fix because entrepreneurs operate in basically systems, very complicated systems. They're really ecosystems, like a pond, like a forest. You have big roots, you have big sky, and then you have a whole lot of diversity in between the roots and the sky. And so what that means is, A, there's no formula to actually get these places moving, to stick your foot in the door. And B, we want to really think about the foundation, right? So when we think about ecosystems, we want to think about the ground, right? And local businesses, local entrepreneurs, what I call the local store, is that ground, is the foundation in these ecosystems. And you have to be really careful about pulling up the ground. You have to be really careful about bringing things in and covering it and suffocating it. You really want to think carefully about how to nurture the ground, but also make room for seeds and other things from the outside to come in. One thing that's really interesting is that everything is local. And I know we live in the world of globalization. A lot of people will probably disagree. But when you open a business, when I open my shoe factory and I'm in Bloomington, Indiana, I'm going to think about Bloomington roads. I'm going to think about Bloomington human capital. I'm going to think about storage facilities, access to logistics and shipping facilities from Bloomington. I may be making shoes to sell in Germany, but I'm actually making them right here, right? Even if I'm making an app to sell globally to people that have smartphones in South Africa and in Kenya and in China, I'm actually still right here making that app, right? And so a lot of the conditions that I'm going to factor in to my decision making are very, very local. When you start thinking about areas that have been hit by terrorism, or by disaster, or in some places by both, all of the local conditions are going to drive your thinking. So I open a shoe factory, and I'm in an area where there's a high risk of a terrorist attack. I'm going to worry about, is my insurance coverage going to be good if I lose inventory? I'm going to worry about, what if electrical facilities go out and I can't actually produce for 3 or 4 days? That means I can't sign contracts to deliver 500 pairs of shoes by next Tuesday because I don't know if I can make them. I don't know if I can hire. I don't know if I should hire because I may not have the capacity to produce. And what happens if I have to drive my inventory through a very insecure region, right? So all of these things factor into my decision-making process as a potential shoe factory owner, and may result in me not starting the shoe factory, starting but not wanting to grow too much and overcommit to production. And in the long run, that in the aggregate, can actually really depress local and regional economies. So if we look at where I sit, this is me, the entrepreneur, and many other entrepreneurs. Those are the little rectangular dots. I'm actually embedded in my local environment. So that's me in Bloomington in a sociocultural context. I'm in the state of Indiana, so things like tax policy, land policy, those are all going to affect me. And then I'm in a country, so I'm in the United States. And then there's all sorts of industry and culture and sector cross-cutting characteristics that are going to affect my business activity and my business decision. Now, if you take me and you take me out of Bloomington and you put me in Iraq or you put me in Syria, my investment decisions are going to be very different, right? And that's the sort of black box for policymakers and for entrepreneurs, because the evaluation of risk is constant. So when we think about things at the local level, we're thinking about many things, but two in particular. One is risk, and the other is information. So what you see is that in underserved communities, information is actually very expensive to acquire, and information is not always reliable. And so if I have to spend a lot of my time as a business owner, as a potential business owner, thinking about getting good access to information so I can understand my market, so I can understand my risk, it's going to cost a lot of time, it's going to cost a lot of money. And so while everything is local, we also have a few gifts from globalization, which is interesting. And so these gifts are basically technology, collaboration, and networks, and the relationship across all three. So it's now possible for local entrepreneurs to get basically real-time access when there's been a break in the supply chain. So that means if I'm sourcing something or I'm part of a supply chain that's in a place that's been hit either by a disaster or a terrorist attack, I will know right away and I can take steps to compensate, right? I will know that I can move inventory based on where my networks are. And so this kind of information has actually sped up the flow of money and business relationships much more quickly than in the past. And so this kind of information is really, really helpful. The other thing is that entrepreneurs are now connected through voluntary associations, through industry associations. I can find out what my partners 3 hours away are doing. And that kind of network is obviously great for business, right? But it's also really good for other things. And so you can build security into these relationships between entrepreneurs. Firms, particularly growing firms, have a vested interest in rebuilding, in resilience. And so using networks across cities and across regions that are underserved or that are frequently attacked is actually a really great option, right? It leads to information sharing, it leads to partnerships, and a lot of lessons that we wouldn't otherwise pick up. So the really interesting thing also about resilience is that entrepreneurs don't just grow in these types of ecosystems where you have good information, you have low risk, and you have the ability to nurture them, but they also contribute. So there's a mutually reinforcing relationship, and that's part of the virtuous circle. So I'm going to leave you with a couple of brief thoughts and then a story from about 2 weeks ago. The first is that there's a lot of smart, talented people in areas of crisis, right? A lot of people leave, but a lot of people stay. And local people are the people that are going to stay. Foreign investment is really great. Wooing big companies to come to your city is also really great. They certainly do create jobs. But local residents, local people stay. And 1, 2 months, 3 months, 2 years after a major attack or after a major disaster, it's local people that are still doing the rebuilding, right? A lot of foreign investment actually leaves, for example, in low-income countries when the country gets too complicated. And so you really want to think carefully about what our policymakers are doing and what we're doing when we're in those positions about balancing big and small, right? So you want, again, the foundation, you want a lot of small businesses, but you don't obviously want to have only small businesses, right? You want to have companies coming in and out of where you are. So we're all responsible for this virtuous circle. We're all responsible for creating this ecosystem. One thing that we haven't spent a lot of time thinking about and that we're just now sort of as a community looking at is the role that entrepreneurs are playing in disasters and in post-terror environments. When you look at a lot of terrorist attacks around the world, what you'll see is that there's a business community that shows up right away. And we've sort of not paid attention to that because we haven't been looking for that. In the terrorist attack in Kenya, which I think people remember in the mall a few years ago, there was a business community right there, right? I was, and this is the story I'd like to share with you, I was down in a small town outside Houston a few weeks ago and brought some supplies down and helped a little bit and found a woman and her husband, both of them small business owners in the local community, and they were working day and night, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., actually probably 10 p.m., every day on Sundays, and they had stopped paying attention to their businesses, which weren't damaged. They stopped paying attention to their businesses, and they set up a full-time distribution center for the local community. And when I was talking to the woman, she told me a lot about what's going on in the local community and how they feel like they might not be a priority with some nonprofits and agencies and things like that. And so I said, well, why are you out here? Why are you out here sacrificing money that you could be making, completely taking over your store for the distribution effort? Why are you doing this? And she looked me dead in the face, and she confirmed everything that I'd already thought, but hadn't heard articulated so well. And she said, well, if I don't, who's going to take care of all our people? Thank you.